All right, so I wanted to give you some examples of how you might be expected to use array list and objects at the same time. So here's the typical setup. The typical setup is the AP exam will give you some sort of random class, right? This is why all year we've been talking about what it means to represent a class, right? A class is a template for an object. And so here, this is the definition of what it means to be an oval object, which is to have instance variables, x, y, and radius. These are private. Because they're private, that means that if you have an oval object, in order to access these specific properties, you have to use the getters and setters, which are provided here. On the AP exam, they might say, these are provided, but the implementation is not shown, which is you don't care what it's inside the body right here. You just care that you have access to these properties by invoking or calling getX or setX and getY. And then here, this is a constructor. So it looks like if you want to create an oval object, then you want to just use the constructor. So then the other part of the setup is you have a class that uses that class, right? So now I have a class here called cart, and as you can see, there's an array list called ovals, which is going to contain oval objects. So this tells me right here what type of objects this array list is going to store. Now there is a cart constructor, and all it does is it sets up that array list, right? Remember, this is not yet created. You don't have the structure until you call the constructor, which looks like this. And then it looks like it just adds 100 items in there. And so now let's talk about the most common things that you might be able to do on the AP exam to show them that you know how to work with array list, right? So again, the basic parts is you're going to be given a class. You just have to kind of read through it very quickly. Don't sit there and read it verbatim. You're going to run out of time. Just scan it. Just go, okay, this is what it means to be that type of class. And then you have getters and setters in the constructor. So now let's say that the prompt is, okay, you have an array list of ovals. We want to get the average radius. So find the average radius of the ovals in the list. So a very typical thing that they will ask you to do is potentially to visit every single element, which is traversing the array, right? So we need to visit every single element, and that typically means that I have to set up a loop, traverse, visit all elements. So for int I is equal to 0, I is less than ovals dot size, and then I plus plus. So, you know, you will be asked to do this on a different array list, right? So here, it just happens to be ovals, and so that's what I'm using. Okay, so then each time I need to grab the radius, which means I need to keep a track of whatever my count is, right? I need to accumulate all of the radius size, the radii. So keep track of every single one of the radii. And so I'm going to call it int total is equal to 0. So then now what we need to do is we need to grab one element. And so on the AP exam, you need to show them that you can grab one element, and then you need to show them that what you're grabbing is an object. So that object represents whatever class that they give you. So for example, I'll call it oval temp is equal to ovals.getI. Right? So now I'm saying, okay, I'm going to grab an object. I'm going to store it temporarily in a variable called temp. And so now I have access to that object. So what do I want to do with that object? Well, I want to add its radius to my total. So total plus equals temp.getRadius. So this part right here is telling me that, okay, they know how to access objects within an array list using the get method. And then not only that, they're recognizing that they are accessing an object and they need to use the getter in order to access the radius for that object. And then finally down here, I'm going to return the average, right? Return average, which is equal to total divided by size. So now your average has to be a double. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to force one of them to be a double. So double average is equal to, so as long as one of the numbers is a double, then the integer division won't happen, right? We don't want to have integer division. When you have integer division, what you have is you're cutting off the decimals, which is bad. Especially because this method is called getAverage, and it says it needs to return a double. So we need to preserve the decimal portions. So we would need to do total divided by the size, which is the number of elements. That would be oval that size. And then finally return the actual calculation. So then the next one is get max, and then we'll do get min, and then potentially call something called move. What we need to do here is return the biggest radius. So if you take a look at the constructor, right, the radius is randomized, and here when we set up the ovals array list, we just invoke the constructor 100 times. So it's going to create 100 oval objects, put them in the list, and those objects are going to have different radii. And so now I need to find the maximum. So what I want to do is assume the first one is your maximum, right? Assume first element is max. So we're going to go int max is equal to ovals.get 0. So again, I'm showing you that you are going to need to use the get method for an array list, right? So it's not bracket notation, that's bad. You want to show that when you have an array list, you don't have bracket notation. And then we're going to do another for loop. So now compare first element with the rest, update max if you find a bigger element. So for int I is equal to 1 now, the reason it goes to 1 is because we already have the element at 0. So we can skip the rest. That's size I++. So as you can see, this operation again requires us to write a loop that will visit all of the elements. And now all we have to do is, so here, remember that the ovals array is an array of oval objects, and so here I'm trying to store the maximum. I can't just do get 0. I want to do get 0.get radius. The reason for that is because of the fact that this part right here is grabbing an oval object, and an oval object cannot be set to be the value of an int variable. What we want to do is have that object return its radius. So this is the same thing as what we're doing here, right? Except this one right here is using a intermediate variable to show you that I am grabbing an oval object first. Here, I'm taking the shortcut and I'm saying this part of the code is going to grab an object, and with any object, I can use the dot operator followed by whatever method is available. In this case, we know there's one called getRad, and I'm going to call that method. So now I'm going to go and say if ovals.get I that getRad. If we find something that is greater than the current max, then we're going to update the maximum. So then we're going to go max is equal to ovals.get I.getRad. So it's going to do that throughout the entire thing. Um, and then finally, what we want to do is return the maximum at the end. Return max. Perfect. So for both of these, I needed a return line because of the fact that there's a return type here, right? Anytime there's a return type that is not void, there needs to be some sort of result being returned by the method. Here, I'm returning the average. Here, I'm returning the max. So now how do we do that for minimum? For minimum, we do the same thing. So I'm going to copy paste this. And then I'm going to Control Shift F. Okay, that's not going to do that. So here, instead of max, I'm going to call it min. So I can do the same thing. I can say that, let's assume that the first one is the minimum. And then every single time we find a new minimum, we are going to update it. So smaller element. But as you can see, you have to recognize all the things that are repetitive. What's repetitive is that you need to show that you know how to work with objects stored in an array list. You need to show that you can traverse an array list. And then finally, if you're writing a method, you need to show that you're recognizing when you need to return data. So here, and what type, right? This is going to be called min. So when you're looking for the minimum, all you have to do is saying, okay, if you look at an element and it's smaller than what you think is the minimum, then you update the minimum to be that smaller thing that you just found. And then finally, you're going to return min. Cool. So now let's take a look at a void method. A void method cannot return any sort of value. So if you, for example, did this, return 1, it's not going to work. That's really bad because, again, this says it doesn't return data. You can't return false either. And lastly, you can't just randomly print stuff out. That's no-no. Big no-no for the AP exam, right? So don't do any of that. So here, I'm just going to randomly tell you that I want you to set the y to be the current y plus 10 for every single oval. So set the oval's y position to be moved by 10. Okay, great. So now we need to figure out how to update the y. So is there a setter for y? Oh, there is a setter. Is there a getter for y? Oh, there is the getter. So we are going to traverse a list because we want to visit every single oval object. We want to get its current y position, add 10 to it, and then set that to be the new value. So I'm going to go ahead and set that up. So I is equal to 0, I is less than ovals.size, I plus plus. So I'm going to grab the oval, I'll call it current, ovals.getI. So again, that line of code is going to grab an object. Now work with the object. Now work with the object. So why don't we grab its y position? Int y is equal to cur.get y. Now let's update y. And then we'll set it to be the new value for cur. Set y is equal to y. So that's me showing you multiple lines of code to accomplish updating y. I'm going to show you now how to do that with one line. So again, I was intentionally doing this because I'm trying to remind you that you're working with an object. That object that you're getting from a list is an oval. Once you have an object, you can just query it for its properties. In this case, we are asking that object, hey, what's your y value? And we're storing that y value in a temporary variable called y. We then updated that y value to be its current y plus 10, and then we're using that to call the setter for the object. So now, wherever that object is in the list, its y value has been set to whatever this value is. But I'll show you the one-liner. The one-liner is ovals.getI.setY, right? So the reason for that is because this part of the code will grab an ovals object. Once you have an ovals object, you know that there's a set y, but what you want to do here is you want to add 10 to the current value. Well, what current value? It's whatever it is at that position, and then whatever the y is. So this part of here, right? So this part is a value that is being passed to set y. If you just take a look at that as its own part, you're just grabbing an oval object at position I, getting its y position, and adding 10 to it. That happens to be the exact same object that you're querying here at position I. So this is the one-line version of all of this, but I was trying to be more concrete in letting you know that we're working with objects when it comes to this array list. Okay, so that's that. I wanted to show you that part. And so now let's show you another one. So let's say, okay, again, remember this is all about working with different types of objects. So here, let's say you have a word pair object, and then I'm going to create a random class that's, I'm going to call it all pairs. I don't know. So what I want to show you again is this idea that you're going to be thrown just random classes on this AP exam, and you just need to know how to work with them. Okay, so here, so again, I told you we want to do a quick scan. Okay, so what does it mean to be a word pair? Remember, a class is a template. It's a blueprint for objects. So what it means to be a word pair is to have a first and second instance variables that are going to hold strings. That makes sense, right? It's a word pair. So the word pair contains two string objects. And then it looks like there's a constructor, a very typical constructor here. You've got your getters and setters for first and second. Okay, cool. So now I'm going to tell you that, okay, I want you to set up this array list of word pairs, all pairs. So public void setup. And I want you to generate all possible pairs of a string array, all words. So here, you've got words stored in a 1D array. So now you're working at a 1D array here. But then you also have to work with an array list. And I'm asking you to set up the array list all pairs to contain word pair objects made up of all possible unique pairs in the 1D array called words. Okay, so now the first thing we want to do when you're asked to set up an array list is you want to be able to invoke how, the instantiation code to create the array list. Remember, this is a declaration right here. This is not an instantiation. The array list doesn't yet exist. This part of the code says, oh, I'm eventually going to point to this data structure. So the first thing we want to do is anytime you're asked to write a constructor or something that sets up an array list, you want to instantiate it. So instantiate the array list. And then there are some where, they're just asking you to work with them. And that's what we did for the other one. So the oval ones, that's what we did here, is that you were already working with an array list that's been set up. So yes, it's kind of assumed that there was a constructor for the cart, and the cart constructor was responsible for setting up the array list. So that's why when we were doing all this stuff, it was implied that you did not have to set up the array list. So again, for a lot of the problem statements, you're going to see that it should be pretty clear that you don't have to set up an array list. You're just using it. So for this example, for the word pair one, right, you are not setting up this parameter called words that's being passed in. So now we have to generate all the possible pairs from words. So if you're generating all possible pairs, you have to do a double for loop, because you're going to go, okay, I want to grab the word at position 0 and then pair it up with position 1, pair that up with position 2, right? So these are, for example, let's say you have 3 things in the list. And let's say it's A, B, and C. What I want is to generate the pairs at location. So I'm pseudocoding here, pairs at 0 and 1. And then I want the pair at 0 and 2. Finally, I want the pair at 1 and 2. So I want unique pairs so that, you know, AB is the same thing as BA in this case. So what we have here is we're generating a loop that visits all of the elements. And then it generates another loop that visits at 1 ahead. So as you can see here, we're going to need 2 for loops. For int I is equal to 0, I is less than words that length, I plus plus. So now, since we were working with a 1D array, the 1D array is notated with the bracket notation, if you don't remember. And so now we're using that length instead of that size. The AP exam will be generous. If you mix up size and length, it's okay, but at this point in time, you should know the difference. Otherwise, you know, just know that you might struggle for this exam. Int j is equal to I plus 1, j is less than words at length, j plus plus. Now here, if you take a look at this list, right, when you're generating pairs, you're going AB and AC, and then finally BC. So your outer loop technically can end 1 sooner, because you're always ending at 1 before the end of the list here. So that's why sometimes you will see that in solutions. But if you ever have anything where you have to generate unique pairs, you're going to have a similar double for loop like this. So now I want to add to my array list, but I want to make sure that I instantiate it, right? So to instantiate it, remember you have to call the constructor. So all pairs is assigned to a call to a constructor. The constructor is creating an array list that it's going to contain word pair objects. And so that's what that line of code is doing. It's saying invoke the constructor, create an array list that's going to store word pair objects. And so this is something that you can just have in your cheat sheet where, you know, this is how you instantiate if you ever need to instantiate. This is what you would use, something similar if you want to generate pairs, right? Unique pairs. And so now we want to create a word pair object. So again, this is supposed to store word pair objects. So now they're testing your ability to instantiate objects. And that means that you have to know how to create a word pair A. So this is declaring a word pair object, and now we want to create a word pair, and we want to call the constructor. The constructor is going to be the part of the code that is named after the class itself, right? There is no return type here. There's nothing called void or int. It's literally the name of the class, and then the type of data it needs to create that object. In this case, it needs 2 strings. And so we need to give it 2 strings. So the 2 strings, what we want to give it would be the stuff in my 1D array called words, word j. So there you go. Again, this is now showing you that sometimes you have to know how to instantiate an array list, and sometimes you also need to know how to work with a 1D array in the context of an array list problem. So they're throwing a lot of things at you, right? So potentially you have to know how to just quickly read through a very simple class, and then you have to read through the specs of a class that uses that class that they just gave you. And then you would typically just complete methods. You're completing a method that does something to your list. That list just happens to use that class. You are sometimes asked to instantiate objects of any type. So here you're creating a word pair object. And then finally, sometimes you have to show them that you know how to use the add methods. All pairs that add a. Now, if you wanted to always add at a specific position, you can do the second type, which is all pairs that add 0. And so if you give it, right, if you give it a position, it will add it at that position as long as that position is not out of bounds. So here, if you kept adding at 0, that means you're always adding to the front of the list. So if you think of a list as, going left and right, you can think of adding at 0 as always adding to the left side of that list instead of adding on the right side. Okay, so again, let me show you again. Sorry, I'm saying again a lot. So let's compare and contrast here. If I'm looking at cart and I'm looking at all pairs, let's take a look at what's the same and what's different. So the two problems so there's a traversal here. So this is a different kind of traversal, but some things that are the same, right? Let's see here. Well, I guess let me add one more problem here. Why don't we have something called check for public int num pairs. So let's quickly add a problem where we want to count how many of the word pair objects there are where the first string is the same as the second string. So remember, a word pair is made up of two strings called first and second. If those two are the same thing, we want to return it in our count. So if you need a count, remember you just add a counter variable first. So here we know that it's going to return an int num int total is equal to 0. Typically, whenever I know that I'm just doing some sort of count, average, etc., I always return ahead of time because I know that I am going to return the results. You can call it result even if you want, and then I can do my calculation here. So then calculation or logic. So now I have to traverse my list called all pairs. So visit all word pair objects in the list called all pairs. So you do have to know the name of the list that you're traversing. Here, the name of the list is not this, right? This is the type. This is the name of the list. So int I is equal to 0. I is less than all pairs that size. I++. Again, even if you're struggling with this stuff, this is stuff that you can add to your notes saying, this is what it looks like to traverse an array list, right? So some of you're completing those assignments online for practice problems. And even though the problems have been repetitive in these types of tasks, some of you are struggling to show that you can interpret the problem and then still be able to use the typical things that you would use. So I'm hoping that this video is going to help some of you. Okay, so now I'm going to decide on something. Check if first is equal to second. So we're going to grab a word pair. I'll call it temp. All pairs that get I. So now we're going to check. So since it's an object, we want to ask the object about its first and second properties. So that means we need to use the getter. So we're going to do temp that get first. Since it's a string, to compare strings, you want to use the dot equals method. You cannot just use double equal signs. You can only do that for numerical types. So dot equals temp that get second. So there you go. Now you're being tested on whether or not you can use the get first and get second commands. And then at the same time, you have to compare them using dot equals. If I wanted to use intermediate variables, I can do string a is equal to temp that get first. And so this might help some of you if you're struggling with that line of code because it's so weird, it has too much stuff going on. Then you can do this. A that equals b. So there you go, right? So hopefully that's easier to read. Now we can see that I'm comparing the first word with the second word. If they're equal to each other, I'm going to do total plus plus. All right, so now we can go back to comparing, the difference between this calculation and then some of the cart calculations. Okay, so here I'm looking for all num pairs where A and B are the same. And so let's compare that with get average. Although they're two different problems, right? One is working with an array list called all pairs. This one is working with an array list called ovals. This one has a property called first and second, and then the getters are called get first and get second. And here we're using something called get rad. But as you can see, right, what's different? Well, in my for loop, I need to say ovals here because that's my list. Here I have to use all pairs because that's the list that I'm talking about now. So the name of the list, of course, will change. And then if we're comparing these two lines of code, right, 23 with 35, well, the stuff that's in the list is different. Here, it contained oval types, and then here, it contained word pair types. For each of these examples, I showed you the class showing what it means to be an oval and showing what it means to be a word pair. Okay, and then now, since those are two different objects, the two objects might have different getters and setters. Here it had a get rad for oval, and here it had get first and get second. So that's what I'm trying to show you here is that you're always going to be given a random class, and so it's up to you whether or not you're gonna, kind of crash and burn. But these are the types of things we've been doing all year. In fact, I use the oval here to kind of trigger your brain on some of the things we've done all year, right? So when we worked with the paddle, we worked with the ball class, we kept going on and on with the oval class, I believe, because we used that in Agario. But yeah. So I think that's it. I wanted to show you kind of what you're expected to do for this problem. Some of the basic things that you need to be able to do. If you're watching this video, you just want to make sure you get these basic things in, because the hardest problem is going to be interpreting, what they want you to do. And again, I'm just trying to show you that, if you take away all of their comments for their classes, they do end up being this simple. Like, oh, okay, it's just a class that represents a word pair objects, which means it has two strings. Okay, it's just a class that represents an oval with an x and a y and then a radius, right? But I'm hoping, you know, your brain gets triggered with the things that we've done in class, in the lab, in all of the written work, in all your tests and quizzes. Um, and that's it. Thanks.